Reid's days had been a tapestry of predictable threads, the insistent bleat of his alarm, the precisely measured coffee grounds, the drone of the city's early traffic. His apartment, a modest rectangle of glass and steel overlooking a ceaseless river of cars, offered a contained existence. He navigated spreadsheets, deciphered dense legal jargon, and met deadlines with a quiet, almost methodical determination. Life was neat, if unremarkable. Then came the call. Not a cheerful jingle, but a formal, clipped tone from a solicitor's assistant. A distant relative, a great-aunt's cousin twice removed, had passed. Sudden. Mysterious. And he had left him something. A cabin. Reid knew nothing of this distant relative, nor of any cabin. He'd barely known his own grandparents, let alone the extended branches of his family tree. The news settled in his stomach like a cold stone. He felt no grief, only a strange, unsettling curiosity. Deep in the forgotten forests of the Northern Territories. The solicitor's voice, devoid of inflection, painted a picture of isolation, of land untouched by modern development. It was an inheritance that felt less like a gift and more like a summons. He spent the next few days in a haze of paperwork and reluctant preparations. The solicitor provided minimal details, just coordinates and a key delivery service. No explanation for the suddenness of the death, no mention of any other heirs. The omission felt deliberate, a silent question mark hanging in the air. A determined man, Reid found himself compelled to see it through, to understand why this forgotten corner of his lineage had suddenly reached out. The journey was long, a slow unraveling of civilization. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt. The signal bars on his phone dwindled, then vanished entirely. The air thickened, losing its urban grit, taking on the damp, earthy scent of ancient pine and decaying leaves. Sunlight, once a cheerful flood, now filtered through a dense canopy, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The silence grew, vast and encompassing, broken only by the crunch of his tires and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Reid felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in, a primal quiet that hummed with a forgotten energy. He was leaving the world he knew behind, entering a space where time seemed to fold in on itself. Finally, after hours of winding through a labyrinth of identical trees, the track opened into a small clearing. There it stood. The cabin. It was older than he'd imagined, a hunched silhouette against the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky. Dark, weathered timber, scarred by generations of storms, formed its walls. The roof sagged in places, covered in moss and lichen, like a forgotten creature from the forest itself. A single, soot-stained chimney leaned precariously. No neat garden path, just a tangle of overgrown weeds and thorny bushes clawing at the porch. Reid killed the engine. The sudden cessation of sound was jarring. He sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, a tremor of unease tracing its way up his spine. This wasn't just a cabin, it was a monument to solitude, a place that had absorbed decades of quiet, holding its breath. He pulled his small duffel bag from the trunk, the sound of the latch echoing too loudly in the stillness. A cloud of dust motes danced in the sliver of light that pierced the gloom. A crude wooden table, 2 chairs, a sagging cot in one corner. Dust lay thick on every surface, a fine, gray blanket. Cobwebs, heavy with age, draped from the ceiling like morbid decorations. This was not a place for comfort, but for endurance. Reid moved slowly, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. He walked from one end of the room to the other, his beam sweeping across the walls, revealing nothing but the stark reality of the cabin's age and abandonment. Then, in a far corner, partially obscured by a stack of splintered firewood, he saw it. A trap door. A large, rusted latch secured it. A prickle of apprehension tightened the skin on Reid's neck. He knelt, brushing away the debris. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers stiff. It groaned, resisting, then finally gave way with a shuddering creak that seemed to echo through the entire cabin. He pulled the trapdoor open. A gust of icy air, smelling of deep earth and decay, wafted up from the blackness below. It wasn't a simple root cellar. This was something deeper, something built with intent. This was an underground bunker. The air down there felt ancient, undisturbed, holding secrets that predated even the cabin above. He had come seeking answers, and it felt as though the cabin, and whatever lay beneath it, was about to offer far more than he was prepared for. The city, with its ceaseless hum and the relentless rhythm of its traffic, had already begun to recede into a distant memory, replaced by the deep, resonant quiet of the forest. Reid's journey to the cabin had been long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to little more than a pair of muddy ruts swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles, a stark contrast to the exhaust fumes and stale coffee of his former life. He spent the first few days in a determined effort to impose order. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that speared through grimy windows, illuminating forgotten cobwebs and the faded patterns of decades-old wallpaper. Reid swept, scrubbed, and aired out rooms that smelled faintly of mildew and disuse, a musty perfume that clung to everything. He unpacked his meager belongings, placing his books on a wobbly shelf, his clothes in a creaking armoire. Each task was a deliberate act of claiming, an attempt to anchor himself in this strange, isolated place. The initial disturbances were easy to dismiss. The wind, a constant, sighing presence around the cabin, often rattled a loose pane in the kitchen window. A branch, heavy with rain, would scrape against the roof, sounding uncannily like something dragging across the attic floor. He heard the house settling, the groans and clicks of old timbers adjusting to temperature shifts, and attributed the occasional, faint whisper he thought he caught on the edge of hearing to the rustle of leaves or the murmur of the nearby creek. He was alone, and his brain, accustomed to the city's constant white noise, was perhaps manufacturing phantom sounds in the overwhelming silence. Yet, a subtle shift began. One evening, after meticulously arranging his camping gear in the small pantry, he returned to the living room to find the worn armchair, which he had pushed flush against the wall, now angled sharply towards the hearth, as if someone had just risen from it. He paused, his gaze tracing the faint indentations in the dusty floorboards. He was certain he hadn't moved it. A trick of memory, he decided, or perhaps he'd nudged it more than he realized. He pushed it back, the legs scraping a protesting sound against the floor. The next morning, his heavy cast-iron skillet, which he'd left on the stove after breakfast, was gone. He searched the kitchen, then the pantry, a flicker of annoyance stirring within him. Had he put it away without thinking? He was usually so methodical. The sheer illogic of it pricked at him. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. He was clearly more disoriented by the isolation than he'd thought. The unsettling occurrences became more frequent, though still small enough to rationalize away. A faint, sweet scent, like dried wildflowers and something else, something metallic and sharp, would briefly permeate a room only to dissipate before he could pinpoint its origin. His sleep grew restless, punctuated by dreams that dissolved into formless unease upon waking, leaving him with a lingering sense of being watched. It resisted, its weight immense, as if rooted to the floor. He grunted with effort, finally managing to drag it a few inches. Beneath it, hidden by decades of dust and the chest's bulk, was a square of rough-hewn timber, perfectly flush with the surrounding floorboards. There was no visible seam, no handle, but a faint, almost imperceptible groove traced its outline. Intrigued, Reid knelt, running his fingers along the groove. After a moment of searching, he found a tiny, almost invisible indentation at one corner. Pressing his thumb into it, he felt a faint click. The timber square shifted, revealing a narrow gap. He wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled, the wood groaning in protest before slowly lifting. It was a hidden entrance, leading down, deep into the earth. This was it, the underground bunker. The walls were rough-hewn, the air heavy and still. The journal felt impossibly old, its cover embossed with a symbol he didn't recognize, a jagged, angular mark that seemed to write even in the dim light. He reached for it, his fingers tingling with an apprehension that was no longer easy to dismiss. This was no settling house, no trick of the light. This was something else entirely. Reid had spent the better part of a week trying to impose order on the cabin, to make it his own. He'd swept away the dust of decades, scrubbed at the grime, and arranged the few pieces of salvaged furniture to create some semblance of home. Yet, with each passing day, the quiet that had initially soothed him began to morph into something else entirely, a thick, expectant silence that pressed in from the forest and seeped through the old timber walls. It started subtly. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across the porch, even when the air was utterly still. He'd dismiss it, blaming the settling of the ancient structure, the wind sighing through the pines. Then, a ceramic mug he'd left on the kitchen counter would be found, moments later, shifted an inch or two closer to the edge, as if nudged by an invisible hand. Reid would scoff, muttering about unsteady surfaces, his own clumsiness. But the rationalizations felt increasingly flimsy, like thin paper failing to cover a gaping hole. One afternoon, while he was trying to pry open a stubborn window frame in the living room, a distinct thud echoed from the floor above. It wasn't the creak of old wood under his weight, nor the groan of the house settling. This was a solid, deliberate impact, as if something heavy had been dropped. He froze, his hand still on the corroded latch. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding thin and absurdly loud in the sudden quiet. There was no reply, only the persistent, low hum of the forest outside. He ascended the stairs slowly, his boots thudding on the worn treads, a prickle of unease tracing its way up his spine. The upstairs was empty, undisturbed. The floorboards were still, the air stagnant. Nothing was out of place. Yet, the memory of the thud lingered, a dissonant note in the cabin's silent symphony. The phenomena began to accelerate, shedding their subtle disguises. He tried to tell himself he was overtired, that his imagination was overactive, fueled by the isolation. One evening, he was reading by the light of a flickering oil lamp, the only sound the chirping of crickets beyond the glass. A faint scratching began from within the walls, directly behind his armchair. It wasn't the rhythmic gnawing of a mouse, this was a deliberate, scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across rough plaster, slow and methodical. Reid held his breath, straining to listen. The scratching continued, moving slowly, as if tracing an unseen path. This wasn't settling wood, nor a rodent. This was something else. He slammed his book shut, the sound echoing sharply. The scratching stopped instantly. He couldn't dismiss it anymore. The cabin wasn't just old, it was active. And whatever was making it active, it was aware of him. He needed answers, and he needed them now. It was time to dig deeper. Reid started with his relatives' remaining possessions. He methodically went through boxes stored in the attic, sifting through yellowed photographs, correspondence, and stacks of old books. Most were mundane, but a small, leather-bound journal caught his eye. One faded article from a local paper, dated nearly a century ago, reported on the disappearance of a surveyor in the very forest where the cabin stood, with vague mentions of unsettling local superstitions surrounding the land. Another clipping, much more recent, detailed his distant relative's sudden demise, noting the lack of a clear cause. Among the relative's papers, tucked into the back of a worn atlas, Reid discovered a crude, hand-drawn map of the property. It was dotted with familiar landmarks, the stream, the old oak, the cabin itself, but one detail stood out, a small, crudely sketched square marked bunker deep in the woods, a short walk from the cabin, but hidden by a dense thicket. His relative had never mentioned an underground bunker. What was it? And why had it been kept secret? The next morning, armed with the map, a shovel, and a growing sense of foreboding, Reid pushed through the dense undergrowth in the direction indicated. The air grew heavy, damp and still, as he ventured deeper. After nearly an hour of hacking through thorny bushes and tangled vines, he found it, a mound of earth, half covered in moss and ferns, with a heavy, rusted metal hatch barely visible beneath the debris. The hatch was secured by a thick chain and a padlock, both corroded to near disintegration. With a grunt, he cleared away the overgrowth, revealing the full extent of the hatch. It was old, built to last, and clearly meant to keep something, or someone, out, or in. The padlock offered little resistance to a well-placed rock, crumbling into flakes of rust. It groaned, protesting loudly, but slowly, reluctantly, it began to lift, revealing a gaping black maw beneath. Steps, narrow and uneven, descended into the earth, disappearing into an impenetrable blackness. The air down there felt heavy, charged with a palpable stillness that was far more unnerving than any sound. This wasn't just a storage space, it felt like a vault, a tomb. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to seal the hatch and pretend he'd never found it. He had to know. He was no longer just experiencing the cabin's unease, he was actively seeking out its secrets, and the implications of what he might find were beginning to twist into a terrifying certainty. The malevolent entity, the pact, the lineage of sacrifice, these weren't just old legends anymore. They were becoming his reality. He had spent days poring over the cabin's meager collection of old documents, each brittle page offering fragmented whispers of a past he never knew. His distant relative, the one who had left him this desolate inheritance, had been a hoarder of secrets, it seemed. But none of them had been explicit. Just hints, shadows, and now, the chilling suggestion that the very ground beneath the cabin held a malevolent history. He folded the clipping carefully, placing it back among the property deeds and crude, hand-drawn maps. One of those maps, barely legible, had a faint, almost erased symbol near the property line, deep in the thickest part of the woods. It looked like a stylized, jagged spiral, unlike anything else on the map. The air outside was heavy, the forest a wall of emerald and umber, silence save for the rustle of unseen creatures. Reid pushed through the dense undergrowth, the branches clawing at his jacket, the damp earth sucking at his boots. He followed the rough coordinates from the map, his eyes scanning for any anomaly in the uniform tangle of trees. After nearly an hour of determined pushing through the wilderness, he stumbled upon it. It wasn't a structure, not exactly. A section of the ground, overgrown with moss and ivy, seemed to sink unnaturally. Beneath a massive, gnarled oak, half hidden by a collapsed stone wall, was a narrow opening. It was a descent, a passage into the earth. A wave of apprehension washed over him, making his scalp prickle. He squeezed through the opening, the rough stone scraping against his shoulders. He fumbled for the powerful flashlight he'd brought, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. The walls were rough-hewn stone, crudely mortared, suggesting a construction far older than the cabin itself. He was in an underground bunker, a place buried and forgotten, designed to keep something in, or perhaps, to keep something out. His flashlight beam swept across the space. It was sparse, almost bare. A crude wooden table, half-rotted, stood in the center. On it, amidst a scattering of dried leaves and earth, lay a single, leather-bound journal. Reid approached the table, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He picked up the journal. It was heavy, surprisingly so, and when he opened it, the pages rustled with a dry, brittle sound. The script inside was elegant, if archaic, written in fading ink. The first entry was dated nearly 2 centuries ago. It spoke of a desperate time, a blight on the land, crops failing, livestock dying. The writer, an ancestor named Elias, detailed the growing despair of his family, their impending ruin. Then, the tone shifted. Elias wrote of the ancient ways, of appeasing the hunger of the earth, of a pact made in blood and soil. Reid's breath hitched. Elias described a ritual, performed deep in the forest, involving a sacrifice. Not of an animal, but of a human life. The firstborn, Elias had written, offered to the ancient guardian of this place, in exchange for prosperity, for life to return to the barren soil. The entries detailed the years of plenty that followed, the land thriving, the family prospering. It waits. Elias wrote of unexplained disappearances, of family members vanishing without a trace, always the eldest child, or the eldest of the eldest's offspring. Then, a name leaped out at him, Thomas, the surveyor, too curious, too close to the truth. The guardian took him, an unexpected offering, but an offering nonetheless. Its hunger is insatiable. Reid's mind reeled. The newspaper clipping. The missing surveyor. It wasn't a random incident, it was part of a pattern, a horrifying, generational debt. He flipped to the last few pages. The entries were sparse, barely coherent, scrawled in a hand that seemed to have lost all control. The final entry, dated only a few years before his distant relative's death, was a single, desperate sentence: "It comes for the last of us. The pact must be broken, or we are all consumed." Reid stared at the words, his blood turning to ice. The entity wasn't just haunting the cabin, it was the land, or at least, inextricably tied to it, an ancient, malevolent force sustained by a grotesque pact his ancestors had forged. And he, the last living relative, the inheritor of this cursed lineage, was next. He wasn't just in a cabin, he was in a cage, and the guardian of this place was finally coming for its due. Reid stood amidst the scattered research, the last words from the journal echoing in the hollow space of the cabin. A pact. His ancestors. The land itself. He wasn't just dealing with a haunting, he was entangled in a legacy, a grotesque inheritance passed down through generations. The cabin wasn't merely a structure built on cursed ground, it was part of the curse, a living trap that had been waiting for him. A sudden, sharp crack from the floorboards above his head made him flinch. He was on the main floor, the sound coming from the small attic space. He knew the attic was empty, just rafters and cobwebs. He had checked it days ago. This wasn't the settling of old wood, it was deliberate, a taunt. A whisper, dry as rustling leaves, seemed to brush past his ear, too faint to form words, yet undeniably present. He spun around, his gaze darting across the room. He needed to get out, to think clearly, to process this new, horrifying layer of truth. He grabbed his phone, the cool metal a small anchor to the outside world, and tried to dial a colleague, someone distant, a voice of reason. The call wouldn't connect. He tried again, then a third time. Always the same hiss, then the click. It wasn't a dead zone, he'd called out successfully just yesterday. The cabin was cutting him off. This wasn't just about disturbing phenomena anymore. This was personal. This was a direct assault on his ability to escape, to seek help. He walked to the window, peering out into the dense, ancient forest. The air outside, which he'd craved moments before, seemed thick and still, heavy with a scent he couldn't quite place, something earthy, metallic, and faintly like stagnant water. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards beneath his feet. It wasn't seismic, it was too localized, too rhythmic. The journal had hinted at secret places, chambers built not for storage, but for other purposes. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to find the source of this new, terrifying vibration, Reid moved towards the cellar door. He descended the uneven wooden steps, the thrumming growing stronger, vibrating in his teeth. The cellar itself was small, packed with forgotten implements and dusty jars. He pushed aside the wood, revealing a heavy iron ring set into the stone. With a grunt of effort, he pulled. A passage, descending into utter blackness. The thrumming was deafening now, reverberating through his entire body. This was it. The source. The heart of whatever malevolence had claimed his lineage. The beam revealed rough-hewn steps leading down, into what felt like the belly of the earth. The stone walls pressed in, ancient and unyielding, smelling of wet rock and something profoundly old, a scent of slumbering ages. The steps gave way to a dirt floor, uneven and soft underfoot. He followed the passage as it twisted, a claustrophobic tunnel burrowing deeper. This was no natural cave. This was the underground bunker. The thrumming, which had been a constant companion, abruptly ceased. Reid felt a profound sense of wrongness, a violation of natural order. In the center of the bunker, bathed in the feeble light of his lantern, stood a crudely carved stone altar. A low, guttural moan filled the space, not from him, but from the air itself. It wasn't a human sound, but something deeper, bolder, a sound of profound suffering and ancient hunger. He stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone, his lantern clattering to the dirt floor, its light flickering wildly. The altar, the tools, the bones, they were not just remnants of a past ritual. They were the focus. And the entity, the ancient, malevolent force tied to the land, was not merely dwelling here. It was feeding here. And he, Reid, was not just an inheritor of a curse, he was the next sacrifice. The understanding had settled on Reid like a shroud woven from dread. Trapped. The word echoed in the empty spaces of the cabin, in the very marrow of his bones. But a quiet, fierce spark ignited within him, a refusal to simply yield. He would not become another forgotten offering. He would fight. His first desperate measure was the most obvious: escape. He lunged for the cabin door, the old wood groaning under his frantic pull, then sprinted towards his vehicle. The air, usually crisp with pine and damp earth, tasted thick and metallic, pressing against his lungs. He fumbled with the keys, his fingers clumsy, the metal cold against his clammy palm. The engine sputtered, a weak, pathetic cough that died almost immediately. He tried again, grinding the starter, but the motor only whined, a sound of mechanical defeat. It wasn't just a dead battery, it felt deliberate, a silent, unyielding refusal. Abandoning the vehicle, Reid plunged into the surrounding forest on foot. The tree line, which had once seemed a natural barrier, now loomed like the entrance to a vast, green maw. He chose a direction, any direction, away from the cabin, telling himself that if he just kept moving, he would find a road, a clearing, something. The forest was not merely dense, it was actively hostile. Paths he swore he'd seen vanished beneath his feet. Branches, sharp as talons, seemed to reach out, snagging his clothes, raking against his skin. The ground beneath the fallen leaves felt soft and unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting to impede him. The silence was the worst, a heavy, muffling blanket that swallowed the rustle of his movements, the frantic sound of his own breath. Lost. Hopeless. Just another. He pushed through a thicket of gnarled oaks, their bark like ancient, scarred skin, only to find himself in a clearing that felt unnervingly familiar. A jagged rock formation, a cluster of oddly twisted birches, he'd passed them hours ago. He was moving, but he wasn't going anywhere. His mind, already a battlefield, started to fray at the edges. Was he seeing things? Was that movement between the trunks, or just the play of light? The distinction blurred, leaving him only with a heightened, sickening awareness of being watched. Exhaustion finally claimed him, collapsing him against the moss-covered trunk of a massive spruce. He had failed. The forest had swallowed his hope whole. He stared at his hands, trembling, raw from pushing through undergrowth. The cabin was likely just a short, terrifying walk away. A new thought, born of desperation and a primal need for answers, began to fester. The underground bunker. He'd dismissed it as merely another part of the trap, but what if it held more than just dead ends? What if it held a key? There had to be something there, something he'd missed in his initial, panicked descent. He wrestled the heavy door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest, a sound like a dying gasp. The descent into the underground bunker was even more harrowing than before. The air was thick, stagnant, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old blood and something else, something acrid and ancient. He moved methodically, searching. He ran his hands along the rough stone, checked behind the few dilapidated shelves, wrapped on the concrete floor. Nothing. Then, in a far corner, behind a stack of crumbling wooden crates, he noticed it. A section of the wall, slightly different. With a surge of renewed adrenaline, Reid clawed at the panel. It was stiff, resistant, but finally, with a splintering crack, it gave way. Behind it wasn't another passage, but a small, shallow recess, barely large enough for a single, leather-bound book. He pulled it out, his fingers brushing against the coarse, desiccated hide. It was a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with elegant, looping script that had faded to sepia over the centuries. Dates of strange occurrences, of disappearances, of offerings. And then, the words, stark and horrifying, detailing a pact made generations ago. A lineage bound by blood and sacrifice to the hungry earth, to the ancient guardian. There were crude, disturbing sketches too, stick figures arranged in unnatural poses. Surrounded by swirling, ambiguous forms. A family tree, meticulously drawn, but instead of branches, it depicted a chain, each name linked to a ritual, a debt. The words on the page blurred, not from fatigue, but from the crushing weight of the revelation. It wasn't just a relative, it was his lineage, his very blood, that was tied to this place, to this insatiable entity. He wasn't just trapped, he was destined. The cabin, the forest, the very ground beneath him, they were not just a trap, but a legacy, and he was the latest, most desperate, inheritor. He spun around, his head aching with the effort to discern. Anything, really. The forest seemed to breathe around him, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale that vibrated in his bones. It wasn't merely that he was lost, it was that the landscape itself had become a looping, mocking riddle, each path leading his back to the same patch of moss-covered stones, the same gnarled root system that resembled a clawed hand reaching from the earth. It wasn't a sound from the sky, but from beneath his feet. He stumbled forward, not by choice, but as if pulled by an invisible tether, his feet catching on roots that seemed to rise specifically to impede him. The trees thinned abruptly, revealing not another clearing, but a collapsed section of earth, overgrown with thorny vines and dark, clinging moss. It looked like a wound in the forest floor. As he drew closer, the metallic tang in the air intensified, stinging the back of his throat. He saw it then, a dark, rectangular opening, barely visible beneath a curtain of ivy and shattered concrete. A sense of profound wrongness settled over him, a primal alarm screaming in his gut, but the strange pull was too strong to resist. He felt a grim certainty, a horrifying recognition, that this was where he was meant to be. He tore away the clinging vines, his hands scraping against the rough concrete. Something organic and faintly sweet, like decaying fruit left too long in a cellar. The entrance sloped downwards, a narrow corridor of roughly hewn concrete walls, dripping with moisture. The air grew heavier, pressing in, making his ears pop. He felt buried alive, the weight of the earth above him a tangible presence. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, a low-ceilinged space that seemed to absorb the light from his phone. The walls were rough-hewn rock, not concrete here, etched with crude, ancient symbols. Geometric patterns intertwined with figures that were unmistakably human, but twisted, elongated, their limbs contorted in what looked like agony or ecstasy. Around it, scattered on the damp floor, were fragments of bone, small, brittle, too numerous to be from a single creature. A low hum began to vibrate through the stone beneath his feet, growing in intensity until it resonated deep within his chest. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a faint, sickly green light, pulsing in time with the hum. His head swam, a dizzying wave of nausea washing over him. Images flooded his mind, overwhelming his senses, a lineage stretching back through generations, a solemn oath sworn in the flickering light of crude fires, a pact with the earth itself. Not a benevolent spirit, but a deep, primal hunger, a consuming entity born from the very soil, awakening when the land was disturbed, demanding sustenance. It fed on the vital essence, on the spark of life. The cabin, the forest, his very presence here, had reawakened it. The sacrifice was not a one-time event, but a generational obligation, a gruesome tithe to keep the earth from consuming everything. And the nature of the sacrifice. A life, pure and vibrant, offered to sate the ancient hunger. And if the offering was refused, if the pact was broken, the entity would claim not just one, but all, tearing through the lineage, leaving only a desiccated husk of what once was. Reid felt a scream rise in his throat, but it was choked by the overwhelming weight of the revelation. His family hadn't simply inherited a cabin, they had inherited a curse, a debt paid in blood, stretching back further than recorded history. He was not merely the owner of a property, but the latest inheritor of a horrifying duty. And he knew, with a certainty that froze his very marrow, that the entity was now demanding his. He was trapped, not by walls, but by a truth far older and more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The twisted birches mocked him, their pale bark like peeling skin under the fading light. He'd seen them before, hours ago, or perhaps mere minutes. Time had become a viscous, shapeless thing in this forest, stretching and snapping without reason. His head throbbed, a dull drumbeat behind his eyes, but a singular, desperate clarity cut through the haze. He was being herded. Not by a physical presence he could outrun, but by an insidious current in the air, a subtle shift in the forest's breath that nudged him, always, in one direction. The ground sloped sharply, unexpectedly, into a ravine choked with ancient, clinging ivy. A fissure, almost perfectly concealed, gaped within the tangle. He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a natural cave. This was a wound in the earth, a deliberate concealment. This was it. The source. The place the cabin had been whispering about, the place his bloodline had been bound to. The passage was narrow, the rough-hewn stone walls pressing in, scraping against his shoulders. The descent was steeper than he anticipated, winding downwards into the earth's belly. A faint, earthy smell, mixed with an almost imperceptible sweetness, filled his nostrils. Finally, the passage widened into a chamber, not vast, but large enough to stand upright, to turn. This was the underground bunker. No light penetrated, but his eyes, accustomed now to the gloom, began to discern vague shapes. The walls were not merely rough stone but carved, covered in intricate, looping symbols that seemed to writhe in his periphery. He approached the slab, his bootfalls unnervingly loud. It was a beacon, a lure. The symbols weren't just decorative. They told a story. Below, etched with a disturbing precision, was a series of names, each crossed out. And at the bottom, a name, partially obscured by a deeper stain on the stone, Reid. His own name. This was the pact. Not a bargain for land or wealth, but a feeding. A lineage of sacrifice, a sustained tribute to something that had anchored itself to his blood. The vortex on the wall wasn't just a symbol, it was the entity, a parasitic core, thriving on the life force of his family. The cabin was merely its anchor, the forest its hunting ground, and this underground bunker, its stomach. As the understanding crystallized, the air in the bunker thickened, becoming almost viscous. The lantern flame guttered, shrinking, as if struggling to exist against an unseen force. A low hum vibrated through the stone beneath his feet, a sound felt more than heard, resonating in his teeth. They stretched, elongated, coalescing into indistinct forms that pressed in from the periphery of his vision. He could feel eyes on him, countless unseen eyes, heavy with an ancient, insatiable hunger. "You've been waiting," Reid rasped, his voice raw, barely a whisper in the suffocating air. He clutched the rough, ancient journal he'd found in the cabin, its brittle pages filled with his relatives' frantic, half-mad scrawlings about breaking the chain. And the journal contained the key, a counter-ritual, a desperate gamble based on ancient, forgotten beliefs. The hum intensified, becoming a low, guttural growl that vibrated through his very bones. It was an entity of hunger, a psychic predator that had fed on his family for generations. It wanted him. It craved him. Reid forced himself to breathe, to focus. He opened the journal to the marked page, his fingers trembling, but his resolve unyielding. The pages detailed a ritual of severance, of offering a surrogate, not of life, but of will. He had to break the cycle. He placed the journal on the altar stone, next to the lantern, and began to speak the words, ancient syllables that felt alien on his tongue, but somehow resonated within the bunker. His vision blurred, his head swimming with the mental onslaught. He stumbled, catching himself on the altar. He was a link in the chain, but he would be the last. He would not let it have another. With a final, desperate surge of will, he finished the last line of the incantation, his voice raw and hoarse, a defiant roar against the silent, consuming horror. As the final word left his lips, a sharp, metallic tang filled the air, and the hum, which had built to an unbearable crescendo, snapped. It didn't fade, it snapped, like a taut wire. Reid stood there, panting, trembling, his entire being vibrating from the psychic assault. The bunker was still, the carvings on the wall motionless. But had he truly broken the pact, or merely wounded a beast that would lie in wait, biding its time for the next in line? The world coalesced around Reid in a series of sharp, painful fragments. Not the forest, not the cabin, but something else entirely. He lay on a cold, uneven floor, the chill seeping into his bones, a stark contrast to the humid, suffocating embrace of the woods. A dull ache throbbed behind his eyes, a persistent percussion that echoed the deeper, more profound emptiness within him. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, every joint a grinding complaint. Water dripped somewhere nearby, a monotonous rhythm that only amplified the oppressive silence. He was in an underground bunker. The realization came slowly, like a word struggling to form on a parched tongue. How he arrived here, he couldn't say. The last clear memory was the twisted birches, the fading light, the impossible loops of the forest. Then, a blur of motion, a guttural cry that might have been his own, and a crushing weight of surrender. His hands, scraped and raw, fumbled along the rough-hewn stone wall. It was enough to outline the cramped space, a single, low-ceilinged room, perhaps 20 feet by 15, with shelves carved into the rock, now empty save for dust and cobwebs. He moved towards the light, each step a deliberate effort. He knew he had faced it, the thing that had haunted the cabin, that had twisted his reality. He knew he had won, in a way. As he neared the glowing crack, a small, leather-bound journal lay half-buried in the damp soil beneath it. His fingers trembled as he unearthed it, the leather stiff and brittle with age. Inside, the script was faded, but legible, a meticulous hand detailing generations of fear and appeasement. It spoke of a lineage, a pact, and the terrible cost of maintaining the fragile peace. Each entry chronicled a sacrifice, not of blood, but of essence. A memory, a dream, a capacity for joy, a connection to another soul, offered to the entity to keep its hunger at bay. Reid's breath hitched. He understood now. The emptiness inside him, the vast, aching chasm where something vital had once resided. He hadn't just fought the entity, he had paid it. He had given it something, but what? He flipped through the journal, his eyes scanning the names, the dates, the cryptic descriptions of offerings. The memory of the mother. A bond severed. The price for peace. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. His mother. The warmth of her laugh, the scent of her perfume, the gentle touch of her hand on his cheek. All of it, gone. Not forgotten, but erased. A blank space where a lifetime of affection and comfort should have been. He could remember the concept of a mother, the role, but the specific, vibrant tapestry of his mother, the woman who had brought him into the world and shaped his early years, was simply not there. It was a profound, terrifying absence, like looking at a familiar landscape only to find a mountain missing from the horizon. A choked sound escaped him, a ragged gasp that tore at his throat. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The entity hadn't just taken a memory, it had taken a piece of him, a foundational stone of his identity. The cabin, he realized, felt different now. Even from this damp, subterranean chamber, he sensed a shift. But the horror wasn't truly gone. He had walked into the forest, a man burdened by an inheritance. He emerged from the bunker, a survivor, but fundamentally incomplete. The entity had been placated, the pact upheld, but at a cost that transcended mere physical injury. He had sacrificed the very essence of his past, a cornerstone of his being, to secure his present. Metallic tang, damp earth, and something else, something acrid and ancient, like burnt paper and dried blood, scraped at the back of his throat. The revelation of his mother's erased existence had shattered the last vestiges of his composure. Not a memory lost, but a life plucked clean from the tapestry of his past. A gaping, screaming void where warmth and comfort had resided, now nothing but a chilling emptiness. The last desperate act of the entity, a final, guttural shriek of defiance that had not been a sound but a ripping, tearing sensation in his very soul, had left the bunker in disarray. Twisted iron rebar jutted from cracked concrete, and a fine layer of pulverized stone coated everything, catching the weak, flickering beam of his headlamp. His hands still trembled, not from fear, but from the raw exhaustion that seeped into his bones. He had done it, he thought. He had severed the connection, broken the pact, or at least, he had stalled it. But at what cost? He moved slowly, his boots crunching on debris, the sound unnervingly loud in the tomb-like space. His gaze swept across the rough-hewn walls, searching for something. A sign. A clue. A final, definitive answer that would stitch his fractured reality back together. Then, at the far end of the bunker, tucked into a narrow recess behind a crumbling support pillar, his headlamp caught a glint. It wasn't the glint of something powerful or magical, but of something mundane, forgotten. A small, wooden box, half buried in a pile of ancient dust and splintered wood. Reid knelt, his knees protesting with a sharp ache. He brushed away the debris, revealing the box fully. It was smaller than he expected, no bigger than his outstretched hand. He felt no immediate threat from it, only a profound sense of melancholy. He worked the latch, which groaned in protest before yielding. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, crumbling fabric, lay a single, yellowed parchment scroll and a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He carefully picked up the scroll. It was brittle, almost disintegrating at his touch. Unfurling it with painstaking slowness, he saw the same forgotten script, but this time, it was accompanied by faded, almost invisible drawings. Not of sacrifice, not of power, but of faces. A lineage. And at the bottom, drawn with a different, more recent hand, was a simple family tree. His own name, Reid, was at the very bottom, connected by a faint line to a name he recognized as the distant relative who had owned the cabin. And above that, stretching back through generations, was a single, stark realization. Reveal/discovery, the scroll wasn't a pact, but a record. A record of those chosen, not to be sacrificed, but to bear the cost. Each generation, one individual was marked, their memories altered, their lives subtly twisted, to maintain the delicate balance. The entity wasn't demanding blood, it was demanding a life, a specific kind of life, lived in the shadow of its power, to keep it contained. The erased memories of his mother weren't a punishment, they were a consequence, a ripple effect of the pack's continuous demand for something to be given. Below his name, faintly sketched, was an empty space, a placeholder. The pack demanded not just a life, but a lineage of lives. He hadn't broken it, he had merely fulfilled his turn. He hadn't defeated the horror, he had merely participated in its perpetuation. The bittersweet victory curdled into something far more sinister. The entity hadn't been defeated, it had simply collected its due from him, and now waited for the next. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the bunker one last time. It felt emptier now, yet also fuller, filled with the invisible weight of generations of subtle suffering. He had faced the entity, wrestled with it, and emerged physically intact, but his mind, his very understanding of his own past, was irrevocably scarred. The cabin stood, weathered and ancient, its windows like vacant eyes. A cage, not for a monstrous entity, but for his own family's fate. He didn't look back as he walked away, the small wooden box heavy in his pocket. The path through the forest, once menacing, now felt like a path to exile. He was free of the cabin's immediate grasp, but he carried its legacy within him. His mother's laugh, a phantom echo in the blank space of his memory, was a permanent scar.